Welcome back. I've given you some starter files, so I recommend watching these videos as you code along as well on your computer. We have a few animal cards here that are extremely cute, obviously. Right now, if we look at what we have an HTML page with just simple divs that contain these little emojis of animals. And if we go to the Style tab, I've pre-filled a few things for you just so things look good. But all we're really doing here is we have a few colors and we've added gradients here just so it looks a little bit nicer. And we have the zones, which are these individual cards with some predefined CSS properties that we've already seen in the previous videos. Just with this base CSS that we see that we have some really nice looking cards. And right now we're using display inline block. If I change this to display block and I save this, let's refresh, we see that we now have blocks. That's great. But we want a little bit more control and perhaps make this grid a little bit more responsive, maybe look a little bit different and just overall cleaner. And when it comes to grids, CSS Grid is a way to go. So how do we use it? Well, the first thing we need to do is to have a container around these items. So I'm just going to create a new div and give it a class of container. We can name it whatever we want, but container is a nice descriptive class name. And we wrap all the items in this container. Now, the way CSS Grid works is very similar to Flexbox. That is, we give it the property of display grid, and all the children will now be able to be part of this grid system. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to have the container class, and this container class will have display of grid. So remember, with Flexbox, we can do flex. It's similar to that. We do display grid. And we no longer want to use the display block of the zones because we're going to have a grid system. So I'm just going to comment this out for now. We've just declared this as a grid system, but we actually need to tell it what to do now. And the most important part of CSS Grid is this property, grid template columns. And most likely, you're going to be using this in all your CSS Grid implementation. And what we can use these grid template columns is to tell our page how many columns we want to use. In here, if I say something like 300 pixels and 300 pixels, I save and refresh here. Look at that. I have 300 pixels and then 300 pixels. And automatically, because I've declared it this way with two definitions or two values, it assumes that we have two grids of 300 pixels and 300 pixels. So if I make this larger or smaller, it's always going to have 300 pixels, two columns. If I add, let's say, another 300 pixels here and save, refresh, look at that. We now have 3 columns. Very, very nice. Another one that you'll see a lot of is the grid gap. And as you might guess from the name, it tells us how much gap we want between the grids. So if I do 20 pixels here and I refresh, I see that we get 20 pixels of gap. Now, this looks really good right now, but if I change things around, this isn't really responsive, because each column is 300 pixels wide. And as we know, users have different display sizes. So you get these ugly grids where you have a white space over here. How would we go about solving this? And you might be thinking, what if we just do percentages here? What if we had 4 columns and we say 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%? If I refresh this, look at that. I have 4 columns, but there's still some scrolling involved. Although we see that things are a little bit more responsive now. Now, you can totally do percentages with grid template columns, and it's definitely a lot better than using something like pixels. But you now have to start calculating the fact that you also have a grid gap of 20 pixels. And well, CSS Grid actually gives us a really good tool that I recommend you use 100% of the time instead of percentages or pixels or EMs or REMs. And that is called a FR, or a fraction. Now, what does the FR syntax mean? If I do one FR here and I save, and let's refresh. All right, I get one item. FR means we have one fraction in this column, so just fill it all up. If I do one FR again, and I refresh, I get two columns. But look at this. As I expand and make it smaller, it automatically resizes. Because I'm saying I want two columns that are one FR, one FR. Now, a better way to explain what this FR value means is if I do something like 2FR here. What do you think will happen? If I save and refresh, this should give you a better idea. All we're saying is we want 3 columns. And in terms of the proportion or the sizes, I want the first 2 columns to be half the size of the third column. Because in terms of fractions, this is twice as big as the other ones. As I make this larger and larger, it's always going to say and keep those proportions. This is going to be twice as large as the other ones. So when you're using CSS Grid, this is the best way for you to maintain this grid system and make sure that it's responsive. How cool is that? Just by writing 3 properties, saying that we want to use the grid system, adding maybe a grid gap and grid template columns with these FR values, we've made a grid system that is quite responsive. But there are a few more properties that we can use in CSS Grid, so let's check them out in the next video.